picture of a typical plant cell so we can see the difference. Typical plant cell. So again, not all plant cells look exactly like this. Cells tend to do something called specializing, which means they take on a very specific role. And that means that they adapt and change their shape to suit whatever role they're playing. And so when we say a typical plant cell, we just mean sort of a generalized version. And we remember that there will be some quite a bit of variation within different plants and cells that do different things. Okay, so I'm going to just erase that title so I have more room for my picture here. But that's what we're doing, a typical plant cell. So I'm going to start like I did with the animal cell, and you're going to find that a lot of the structures are the same. If you go back to the animal cell video, the explanations of all those structures are the same, nothing changes. So really this will be short because we only have to add on things that are different for plants. First of all, one of the main differences is plant cells usually tend to have more of a structure to them. They're not like just blobby, wiggly things. They tend to have a sort of a squarish or brick-like kind of shape. So this is the cell membrane, and we'll label it again after, okay? We'll label all the pieces. So it looks like a big piece of bread or something, I guess. Now, the cell of a plant has something special that the animal cell did not. And it's kind of hard to draw here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw it sort of in a green color, I guess. Or maybe I can find some other color, like maybe this nice brown color here. And what happens is there's a special molecule called cellulose, which is a kind of carbohydrate, ends with O's, remember? And so this carbohydrate is secreted outside of the membrane, and it forms a hard, sort of rigid wall. And so to draw that, let me see if I get a crayon here and try that. So I'm going to just kind of go around like this. Whoops, got my wrong color. And I'm just going to go around like this, sort of shaded in. And what this is it's a rigid structure called the cell wall, made of essentially a kind of carbohydrate called cellulose. And this structure goes all the way around the cell. I'm just making it a little darker here. And what this does is it builds a sort of a matrix or like a frame that strengthens the cell and gives it a very rigid structure. Animal cells are squishy and gooey, but plant cells have this wall which makes them more rigid so that they can sort of form, it's like a scaffolding, I guess you could say, and plant cells link together and they form like little bricks on top of each other. And they makes for a more rigid structure. So if you think about, for instance, wood, the wood of a tree is actually plant cells, and it's very hard and durable. We need an axe or a chainsaw to cut through it. And that's because it's made up of cells that all have this very rigid and strong cell wall. Other plants like have a stem, like on a flower, and the stem has to stretch up into the air, and it has to be strong enough that it doesn't fall over. So it has to be rigid and strong, and that's what this cell wall will do. Okay, go back to my pen, and we'll get some red here. And we'll draw ourselves a little nucleus sort of inside the cell like this, just like before. And while we're at it, well, let's just go one step at a time, I guess. All right, so yeah, while we're at it, we'll add in here a little region in the middle. Remember the nucleolus, so we'll put that in as well. And then, if I take my blue here, I'll try to use the same colors I used in the last video, just so it's consistent. Remember the windy membrane that comes away from the nucleus? It's called the Endoplasmic Reticulum. So we'll put some of that in. And remember that it's all through the cell, but we only tend to see it because of the 3D nature, right? The 3D picture, we only see sort of a slice through the cell, so we don't get to see the endoplasmic reticulum packed all in there, all around the cell. And then, of course, there are the little ribosomes. I think I used a dark blue color for the ribosomes last time. So we'll put those little ribosome dots and they're found along the ER. I may not have mentioned this in the last video, but part of the endoplasmic reticulum has the ribosomes on it and part doesn't. So we actually call it the rough endoplasmic reticulum and the smooth. We distinguish between them. So the rough part is the one that has the ribosomes in it, and the smooth part is the one that doesn't, usually further away from the nucleus. Not a critical point, but just something interesting. There are also mitochondria. So let's draw some of those little sausage guys with their little membranes like this, the double membrane. And remember, these are the same structures as in the animal cell. They perform the same functions, right? So the nucleus has the DNA and the genes for plant cells. The nucleolus builds the ribosomes. The ribosomes are the protein factories. The endoplasmic reticulum is the canal system through the cell that allows for the movement of molecules and cell structures. It's also a membrane that can serve as a surface for chemical reactions and things to happen. So that's all the same. The mitochondria are located all around the cell. I will draw more over here. And again, they are the ones that are burning glucose. They are the energy sources of the plant cell as well, because plants need energy. You can guess, though, that some cells that require a lot of energy have a lot of mitochondria. Like a muscle cell in a human has a lot of mitochondria, whereas a plant cell may not have as many because plants don't have as elaborate energy demands. They don't do a whole lot, right? They don't play football. They basically just sort of sway in the breeze. So they do need energy, but maybe not quite as much. Now, what's interesting about the plant cell is, I'll draw it in the black again. Plant cells tend to have a very large vacuole, and it's hard for me to draw this. It's sort of I'm going to draw like this. It's kind of in the center of the plant cell all around. So there it is, a very big vacuole. And the reason for that is because plants require very, very precise water control. And this big vacuole is a water storage vacuole that allows the plant to control its water. You know what happens when a plant gets not enough water? It wilts because it dries up. When this vacuole is full of water, it pushes outward and expands inside the cell, and it makes everything packed and tight, and everything pushes out against the cell wall. So it's like a water balloon under pressure, and it's rigid. But if the plant gets dehydrated, then the vacuole will shrink and the cell will become flimsy, right? It'll become flimsy. So they usually have a very large vacuole, which is different than animal cells. Animal cells have relatively small vacuoles. They also have other sort of vacuoles that serve like different jobs, like the different lysosomes and peroxisomes and things like that. So we can put one of those in here on the side. Let's see. We don't often see centrioles in a plant cell. Typically, animal cells have centrioles, plant cells don't. So we won't put those in. There is one very important thing, though, that plants have that animal cells do not, and I'll choose green for this, and you'll see why. These are called the chloroplasts. Okay, so the chloroplasts are these large structures. And inside, they're very much like a mitochondrion. They have an internal membrane, but the internal membrane is slightly differently arranged. So I'm not going to get into those details, but they have a membrane inside like the mitochondria that helps with their job, but it's a complicated membrane with lots of little stacks and folds and things. Anyway, we're going to put lots of these because the plant has a lot of them. The chloroplasts are structures that contain that cool molecule chlorophyll, which can take sunlight energy, right, and turn it into glucose. So these are the factories that make the glucose. The mitochondria burn the glucose. The chloroplasts actually produce or make the glucose. Now, they're only found in plant cells, and they're primarily what makes plants look green. There's so many of them, they just kind of take over, and the plants look green because of the chlorophyll in the chloroplasts. All right. Now, because of the cell wall that surrounds the plant cell, we don't usually see, there's really not much of a need for cilia or flagella. So Most plant cells don't really have much external structure like that. They basically have a cell wall and that's it. And let's see, what else could we put in our picture here? I think I used this nice little brown color here last time for the Golgi apparatus, which is also present. And remember, those are the little pancake stacks that we find on the sort of near the edges of the endoplasmic reticulum, a little further downstream from where the ribosomes are, because those are the places where the proteins made by the ribosomes end up collecting and then get sort of processed, right? They get adjusted, they get little bits of things added onto them, or they sometimes get wrapped up in another molecule and all kinds of interesting things so that they can better do the job that they need to do. Okay, let's start some labels here. So since I have that already, that color, I'll put that line over here and I'll put Golgi Apparatus. Golgi Apparatus. I'll get the purple and do the mitochondrion while I'm at it. I can probably put him up here. Mitochondrion. There he is. Oh, let me just plug that in. Okay. And then we can do green here for our chloroplast. So I'll put that over here. Chloroplast, which contains the chlorophyll. We'll talk about that after. We can do a blue for the endoplasmic reticulum. All through the cell. There's some over here, and maybe I could draw this arrow here, and I could put another arrow over here, just to show it's all over the place in the cell. We have the ribosomes there in the dark blue color. So I could draw a line maybe from this guy right through here like this, the ribosome. Oh, and remember, there's sometimes ribosomes that are found throughout the cell. Not all ribosomes are locked onto the endoplasmic reticulum, so we could put a few of them like this, sort of around on the outside, and maybe draw a line to them so we know what they are. Ribosomes. They're not always on the endoplasmic reticulum, but most of the time they are. Let's put the vacuole in here. I'm going to put large vacuole over here, and over here I'll just put small vacuole. And remember, the vacuoles can also serve other functions. They contain all kinds of soupy mixes of chemicals to do different functions and jobs. Let's see, what else do we have? The chloroplast? Oh, the nucleus. Let's get the nucleus here. So let me do the nucleolus first. I'll bring them down around here like this. Oops, I forgot to make that smaller. The nucleolus, which is the ribosome factory where they're made, and then underneath it, I'll swing down here and put the actual nucleus, which contains the DNA. So make sure that's spelled right. Nucleus. All right, I don't think I've missed anything. Oh, yes, I have. Hang on. The cell membrane is sort of on the inside like this. There's the cell membrane, just like the animal cell. But we also have this new structure in this brown color, which is called the cell wall. Cell wall. And that's the structure out here. All right, and I think we've labeled just about everything on the picture. And so what we'll do now is just take a minute to talk about some of the things we haven't already discussed. Okay, some of the things we didn't see on the animal cell, which is basically the cell wall and the chloroplast. Okay, so let's look at some of the differences here. First of all, we have the chloroplast. The chloroplast is a new structure that we did not see in the animal cell. And of course, this is the structure that contains the chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is the molecule, chloroplast is the structure that contains it, contains chlorophyll, which traps sunlight energy and converts it to chemical energy in the form of glucose. So the plant makes sugar. Remember, glucose is a very simple sugar. Glucose. And there's the reverse equation. Remember the respiration equation from the animal cell. This is the backwards equation where now the plant collects carbon dioxide from the air, 6 of them. Instead of breathing it out, it collects it. It combines that with water, H2O, 6 of them, and it then makes, whoops, let's put an arrow there, not a plus sign. It makes C6, H12O6, which is that big glucose molecule, and it releases oxygen gas, O2, 6 of those as well for the balancing. And so really this equation can go both ways, right? So when we go this way, there's an additional requirement. I'll put it above here in green. We have to have chlorophyll present for this to happen. So we usually write this over top of the arrow because that provides the energy. The energy from the sun has to go in here. So maybe I can put here, sunlight is necessary. This reaction doesn't just sort of go on its own. It requires energy going in, whereas the other reaction had energy coming out. And it made that, remember that ATP molecule, which was a little energy storing molecule for animal cells and plant cells to use. So these green things here are requirements extra, where energy has to go into the process. If there was no sun, plants couldn't do this on their own. All right, so that's basically what the chlorophyll are doing. The other thing that the plant cell has that the animal cell does not would be the cell wall. So the cell wall is basically, I'm going to say it's a matrix of carbohydrate. Matrix of carbohydrate, right? Typically that carbohydrate is called cellulose, but not all cell walls have to have the same thing in them. Cellulose, but that's one of the main components. And of course what that is for humans, when we eat food, our bodies cannot digest cellulose. It stays in our system, it goes right through us. So what it does is it forms a fiber. That's what we call fiber. The foods that we eat that are high in fiber are obviously plant foods that have cell walls made of cellulose, and that fiber basically pushes things through our digestive tract. So the cell wall is a matrix of carbohydrate, cellulose, but we often call it fiber when we're talking about our diet. It's the same thing. And the purpose of this, of course, is to provide a rigid, framework to support plants, as they grow. Okay, and you can think about structures like the stem of a flower. It has to be able to stand up, right? It can't wilt and droop and fall over like this. So it has to be strong. And the cell, if you didn't have a cell wall, the membranes of cells wouldn't be enough. It would just be all droopy. So the cell wall helps provide that rigid structure. And in conjunction with that, the other thing that works to help this stay rigid is that big central vacuole full of water, which is like a giant water balloon under pressure inside the cell, right? So we'll write about that in a minute. Or even the trunk of a tree, a giant tree trunk. When we talk about wood, wood is essentially this cell wall material. That's what wood is. We chop it up and we use it to burn in our fireplaces and so on. So it's quite useful to us. But for the plant, it allows trees to grow hundreds of feet up into the air and not fall over. Very strong. So that leads us then to the vacuole, the large vacuole. Right? And again, this controls the water pressure inside the cell. Plant cells like to have lots of water pressure, which is why we water them all the time. They suck the water in through their roots, it goes to all their cells, and it fills that vacuole, which expands like a giant water balloon. And it pushes outwards against the cell wall, so it makes the cell rigid and strong. Whereas if it dries up, like a water balloon that's sort of, losing its water, it gets all flimsy and floppy, and it's not firm. So it controls the water pressure, which is more important in plants. I mean, it's important in animal cells too, but it's a vital part of plants and how they work. When you get into your grade 11 biology class, you'll learn about how plants use water pressure to do all kinds of interesting things. The other thing we should make a note of is it's a missing structure, and that is that the centrioles in the plant cell are missing. They don't have, or we don't see centrioles in plant cells like we do in animal cells. And I think that's all the major differences. Everything else on the picture that we drew, we've already explained in our previous lesson on the other video of the animal cell. And they all do pretty much all the same sort of roles. So we don't need to go into all that detail again. So there is a plant cell. Now, we've drawn these pictures of animal and plant cells, but what I'd like to do now is perhaps just show you some Google pictures. So we'll flip over here to Google, and if I type in here, animal cell, and we get some images, you'll get some pictures that are a little more 3D, so you can see the effect of what the cell. Here's one here that shows the cell sort of as a blob, and then it's kind of cut open, and you can see all these things inside of it. The Golgi apparatus. They're calling it the Golgi complex. That's just another name for it. Vesicles is another name for those little membrane-bound vacuoles that I was talking about. There's a big vacuole, mitochondria, nucleus, and so on. We can see all the things on here. Some other things, lysosomes and peroxisomes, and so on. There's the centrioles right there. If I go to another picture here that I saw, where was it? At the start. This one looks even better in terms of 3D. You can kind of see how complicated it is. On our picture, it looks like there's lots of empty space in there, but there isn't. It's pretty packed. There's the fluid everywhere. You can see the endoplasmic reticulum winding all around, and there's all the different things that are packed into the cell. We also haven't talked about another part of the cell inside called the cytoskeleton, which is a framework of tubules that give the cell its shape. We're going to talk about that a little more when we get to it later on. So there's an animal cell that's really more closely what it would look like, more close, a better approximation. You can see some of these here. Let's try this one. You can see here, see the endoplasmic reticulum is filling up almost all the cell. It's all over the place, and everything's in there sandwiched. Now, if I go to plant cell, just to get a picture, and of course you can Google these pictures yourself. Here's some typical plant cells, and we can again get, you can see the main central vacuole. So if I go to this one, which is pretty simple, whoops, this one here, right, there's the large vacuole sort of in the middle that's full of water to keep the plant cell rigid and high pressure. See the chloroplasts, the mitochondria, and the other things. This one isn't very detailed. Here's a 3D one, sort of showing the same thing. And so you just get the idea of, and remember, if cells are not flat, they're three-dimensional structures that are hard to draw on a board and get the full idea. Here's another example where you can see how everything is pretty packed in. So there's some pictures of cells as well, just kind of to have in your mind. And that's as far as we'll go here. Our next video, we'll start looking at some other different types of cells, and we'll start looking at how cells kind of evolved. And we'll look at things like bacteria cells and little protist cells that can live all by themselves and swim around microscopically in the water. And we'll talk about those in the next little session.